which was ratified in 1920, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. You know, I think about my grandmother who was born in 1903, 17 years before women could ever vote. And I wish I could ask her how she felt about that, or how her mother felt about that. So we are going to have several speakers who are going to talk about the events in Birmingham that have directed the course of voting in the United States, and I will do those introductions now. We had planned to have Mrs. Ruth Barefield-Pendleton join us, but Miss Barefield-Pendleton is 100 years old and just was not feeling up to this outing today, so we will miss her, but we are excited for our speakers. Donna Dukes, who is on our board, will moderate this discussion. Donna, as many of you know, is the founder and executive director of Maranatha Academy, born and raised right here in Birmingham, and graduated summa cum laude from Miles College in 1991, which is the same year she founded Maranatha Academy, which has graduated more than 300 students and impacted the lives of over 1,500 individuals. Donna's life goal is simple: to help critically at-risk youth and adults attain their dreams of earning a high school diploma, to improve self-esteem, and to promote inclusiveness, acceptance, and personal responsibility. That should be my life goal as well. And then we also have joining us T.K. Thorne. She's a retired captain in the Birmingham Police Department, and she is also retired as the executive director of the Downtown Business Improvement District in Birmingham. Both those careers and a master in social work from the University of Alabama provide fodder for her writing. TK has written 2 award-winning historical novels, Noah's Wife and Angels at the Gate, and the New York Post Books You Should Be Reading list featured her first nonfiction book, Last Chance for Justice, which details the investigators behind the scenes stories related to the 1963 Birmingham church bombing case. Her newest book is House of Rose, and I think she's got another one coming. I should also say that Gail is recording this meeting, so y'all don't cuss or anything that you don't want on a recording. And last but certainly not least, joining us today is Jeff Drew, who is a native of Dynamite Hill, I was told, not Birmingham, Dynamite Hill. And he attended, integrated, and graduated from Inslee High School. Jeff was a civil rights foot soldier alongside his parents, John and Adine Drew, as well as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He's published numerous articles about the civil rights movement and is a frequent speaker. Jeff is deeply concerned about the future of young people and continues in the struggle for racial equity and justice. Thank you all for being here today. And with that, I'll turn our program over to Donna and our speakers.
All right. Thank you so much, Mon Capitan, which is what I call Audrey, our illustrious president. It is an honor to facilitate the panel. I know we're going to gain so much from it. And as I was saying while we were doing our informal chat to Jeff, thank you again. This is about the 100th time he's pulled my fat out of the fire. But we civil rights kids, or kids of civil rights icons, always look out for each other. So that is a very good thing. We just want to dive right in and talk about the fact that as women, I cannot think of an election year that is more pivotal or important than this one. And when I had the chance to bring together T.K. Thorne and Ruth Barefield-Pendleton to talk with each other about the elephant in the room that most people ignore, which is the involvement of whites in the civil rights movement, I heard the amazing connection that they had, and I wanted it shared with the Women's Network. Unfortunately, Mrs. Barefield-Pendleton is not able physically to participate in the call today, but she will be present with us through a couple of clips I will play on the vote of her role in the movement. So what I wanted to do, since we are talking about women's suffrage, and since, to piggyback on what Val said, I had the chance to go to Sidewalk Film Festival and see two amazing documentaries that talked about how the Voting Rights Act has just been decimated in many cases, and why it is so important for us to try to outsmart the people that are trying to keep us from being able to vote. I wanted to play this clip, and yes, I'm a daddy's girl, so it's going to have my dad in it, but I want to make sure that I have shared the audio. So what a lot of people don't understand is that in Birmingham, Alabama, there was a situation where a lot of things were attained even before Dr. King came to town. In fact, it was one of the requirements for him to really be able to come in. So can everybody see the screen? You should see a chocolate gentleman that I look exactly like. Okay, very good. So here we go.
He was also a veteran and had a lot of more common sense and knowledge than the average student.
In 1961, I was elected student government president. Dr. Pitts summoned me to his office one day and asked me if I would organize the students in a voter registration drive. At that time, there were less than 8,000 voters in the entire state, black voters in the entire state of Alabama. It was very difficult to become registered voter because you had to pass an exam with approximately 100 questions. And many of these questions were ran from the ridiculous to the sublime. For example, there were questions on the test like, how many bubbles in a bar of soap? And if it were a woman taking this exam, well, there would be questions that, like, have you ever had an abortion? Have you ever had any stillborn children? There would be questions like, name all the members of the House of Representatives in Alabama, and in the Senate, and in the United States Senate, and in the United States Congress. So it was very difficult to become registered voter. Plus, we had to pay poll tax, which at that time was $1.50.
Foot soldier named Gay sacrificed and paid it.
Because a voteless person is a hopeless person.
And that's where I think I want to stop. A voteless person is a hopeless person. As women, we were so victimized. And in addition to trying to figure out if we'd had abortions or stillborn children, if it was a married woman, they would ask, Black married woman, they would ask, when did you get married? And do you have any children? And if you had children, you had to tell them when their oldest child was born. And they would literally count backwards from your wedding date to the birth date of your oldest child and say, oh, you were pregnant when you got married. You can't vote. Wouldn't even let them take the test. So it's a very close to my heart subject. And I am so thrilled that we have two people who truly understand the importance of voting rights. And I would love to talk about one of these like God moments, because both of these individuals are the children of women who were in this organization that I want to talk about today, the League of Women Voters, talking about how important it was for women to vote. And it was an interracial group. So I get excited when I think about it. I would love for Jeff and TK to talk about their mom's role in the League of Women Voters and how it's still so relevant today for women to exercise this right. Whoever wants to go first.
Ladies first.
You're muted, TK. You're on mute.
Okay, now am I?
Yes.
All right, that actually mute might be the best way to listen to me. Okay, so my mother, who unfortunately died way too young, she died when she was 55 years old, and I miss her every day. But she was Jane Loebman Katz. She was born in 1931, and she was born to Jewish parents. And she worked for about 22 years to, they said she waged a war against poor government in Alabama. So I grew up in this atmosphere of hearing about efforts to make education better and equalize property taxes and consumer protection laws. I remember she took me to a strip mine site and when I was little and said, this is what happens when we don't pay attention to our environment. And I'll never forget that lesson, looking at that. And anyway, she ran for office twice. She fought for strong ethics laws and interestingly, the background investigation of child care providers. That is not something I would have put in her bailiwick, but that was something she believed in. She was a tough fighter for the adoption of judicial reform in the judicial article that changed a lot of things in Alabama. And I'll let some lawyers discuss how that's changed things. Anyway, she was the state lobbyist for the League of Women Voters. And one thing that she did, which had really never been done before, she started a newsletter called the Capitol Newsletter. And she would track all of the bills that were of public interest, and she would let people know who had sponsored them, where they were, if they were in committee, or who to contact to help get it out of committee. She, my memories of her are always at that typewriter. And I remember, she would be typing on, anyway, I have a lot of memories of her sitting at that typewriter, but she always managed to be mother somehow, which was to me amazing. She would pull casseroles out of the freezer and entertain guests. And we had guests from the civil rights movement that would come regularly to our house in Montgomery, Alabama. So League of Women Voters was a huge part of her life, and it was just all the things that there were for were part of the air that I breathed. I was so fortunate. So that's my mom. Jeff, tell us about Deanie.
Gee whiz, my mom was full of courage and and full of vinegar, I should say. She was a native of Ardmore, Pennsylvania, which is a well-to-do township right north of the city line in Philadelphia. And she and my dad met in Tuskegee, Alabama, in 1946, I think it was, where she left her job at Macy's in New York City and took the train to Tuskegee. When the train reached Washington, D.C., the conductor told her that she was white and needed to move into the white section of the train. And of course, Mom refused. And an altercation occurred, and they had a big fight, and she had to wait. And finally, she got on the train in the colored section and made it to Tuskegee. Her family was adamant that she was going into the fire, but Mom was adamant that someone needed to go into the fire. Mom had courage beyond my belief as a child, and she just wasn't going to be denied the opportunity. Apparently, in her childhood and in Philadelphia, and during the war, women were important. Women had a role to play in not only the war, but in America. And she was determined to come to Alabama. She went to work at the Veterans Administration, the Colored Veterans Administration Hospital in Tuskegee, as a candy striper. And of course, that's That's where she met Dad, and Dad had a hard time because of Tuskegee Airmen with those wonderful uniforms and scarves and flying airplanes all over the place. Dad said he didn't think he had a chance, but he finally camped out and touched my mom's heart. They moved to Birmingham in 1950, and shortly thereafter came the Rosa Parks bus boycott, and Dad and Mom met Martin at the church there at Ebenezer in Montgomery, and Martin asked, the meeting was about Dad providing insurance for church buses, and Dad was able to do that. Montgomery was fighting against the bus boycott by requiring churches to have commercial insurance to take people to work. Nevertheless, Dad succeeded in getting the insurance, and when Martin asked when he was in Birmingham if he could spend time with us here at the house. Mom and Dad were already social people and already involved in voter registration, so they said yes, and I guess the rest is history. But he became Uncle Mike in our house. Mom and Dad were already involved in voter registration before they met Martin. Fred Shuttlesworth and my Aunt Ruth. By the way, Audrey, she's not 100, she's 94, and I'm sure she would want me to make that correction on
I apologize. I could have sworn somebody told me 100. 94.
She was my mom's best friend, and they were thick as thieves, as Donna and then Frank Dukes, and if Lucius was still here, Lucius Pitts, the president. These were motivated women, ladies. These were women that were not going to be denied, and not only that, they were clever and smart. Many times, Mom and Martin would have skull sessions as to how to defeat some of the antics of Bull Connor, and many stories came out of that. But one in particular was the dog whistle story, where Mom, who was very light in skin color, she dressed up and put on her long gloves and drove out to what is now called Hoover, and to a kennel. Bought many boxes, there you go, thanks, many boxes of dog whistles. Mom was so upset about the dogs fighting the marchers that she convinced Martin that maybe the dog whistles would help, and sure enough, we got them and passed them out at the St. Paul church to the marchers, and it worked. Little things like that, little things like that gave me the inspiration.
Oh, Lord, sweet in the mouth.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Anyway, voter registration was paramount, and courage, which is, I think, more important than voter registration itself, was the actual courage that the women had. The men were working mostly in blue-collar work jobs, and the women were charged with helping the men get motivated, pass that horrible examination to register to vote. Well, they had the time to do it, and so they held classes at the Masonic Temple. They held classes in their homes, and not without some threats, by the way. But nevertheless, it was important to get these people registered to vote so that we could show the power of voting. We, in the 1950s and early in the 60s, state government was resistant of any sort of black power or any sort of voting power that wasn't white. And in 1965, 250,000 African Americans were registered to vote by federal examiners. But when our numbers began to swell up in voter registration, then we began to realize the power of the vote and the power of a collective community. I cannot express to you strongly enough how we would have failed without the women. The women were teaching at night, they were teaching in the daytime. Literacy issues and just hands-on help, mother and child type help. And this gave Black men a sense of being, a sense of purpose. It said that our vote, even though it was just one vote, it was indeed, how do you say, it was indeed the right thing to do. Our vote counted. And when there was a certain amount of joy when we were able to see Black folks getting the ability to vote, seeing the result of the vote. It gave us a sense of community, a sense of caring for one another and caring for those ideals that we voted for: equality, justice, and of course, anti-racist stuff. Nevertheless, it was the motivation, it was the work of the women that gave us most of our motivation in the early days of the pre-civil rights movement.
And that's something that I wanted to really touch on. I'm sorry, Jeff, but you know, I get excited when I hear you talking about this. I wanted to touch on the fact that in TK's book, she talks about, and I'm not talking about you like you're not here, TK. I'm actually going to wrap up a question and give it to you. TK talks about this amazing organization that your mom and Mrs. Ruth Barefield-Pendleton were very involved with, called Friends in Action. And I just really love the story of that. I want to share a photo of this amazing woman who is not able to physically be here with us today. Can everybody see this photo? Okay, this is Mrs. Ruth Barefield-Pendleton, circa 1964. She is my shero. She was actually voted one of the best dressed women in the entire United States of America in 1964 by Ebony magazine and made the cover. So this is the cover of Ebony magazine. And she talks about the fact that there was this organization called Friends in Action, and it was an interracial organization. So TK, if you could talk about the importance of Friends in Action, whether something like that would be relevant today, you know, what role it played, and the fact that, you know, why is it that the involvement of whites has been so largely ignored with the civil rights movement?
This is one of my favorite stories about what happened. And this actually, I have come to believe in my research that the official organization began sort of with Dr. Lucius Pitts at Miles College. But prior to that, there was an organization called the Council of Human Relations. And that was, it was a subgroup. There was a Birmingham chapter, an Alabama organization, and a regional Southern organization. And it was an interracial group. And they really had formed, the bigger organization had formed to fight lynching. But it had evolved here, you know, locally, to a group of people, Black and white, who met each other. And they met regularly, and they talked about what was going on in Birmingham at the time. They talked about the complaints against police brutality, and they talked about inequity, and they invited Black speakers to come and talk. And all of this was actually, it wasn't illegal for them to meet, but it was illegal for them to sit together. So, you know, according to the Jim Crow. Thank you, Jim Tom. According to the laws, Blacks and whites had to meet separately. I mean, they had to sit separately. They couldn't sit together. But this group ignored those things, and they, you know, they met in different places, and they began to have relationships, as people do when they come together and talk to each other. And that's probably the most important lesson for all times, is that it's about relationships. It always has been, and it always will be. But anyway, back in that time, they wanted to do more. And so they they met with Dr. Pitts at Miles College, and I believe one of the photographs that was briefly shown in your film, Donna, might be that meeting, because there were blacks and white women got together and went to talk to Dr. Pitts and said, what can we do? How can we make it better? And he said, well, you know, I think if you'll just sit down and have a cup of coffee together, that you might find that you are human beings, and that might be, you know, something to do. And they did. They didn't, I don't think, and it's hard to know exactly when they became friends in action. I think they just started meeting in each other's houses at first. And according to Ruth Barefield-Pendleton, they actually met in the black women's houses first, because it was actually safer than going to the white neighborhoods, which is something to ponder. And they started getting to know each other. And Jeff, I believe your mother was involved in that too. And eventually they became an organization called Friends and Action. And they continued to meet in each other's houses, and they started talking, you know, intently about what the issues were. And then they actually started doing things. They got a little money from the federal government, and they opened this was after 1963, when they could do this, they opened integrated playground in Birmingham. I'm not real sure where it was. And they did other things. They went together. At one time, they went together to look at Miles College, and they were just taken back by the fact that the science labs had no equipment, or very little equipment, and they worked to get UAB to donate equipment. So that was the origin of the groups, and they later became the Panel of American Women in 1964, I believe. And as such, this was like after, okay, 1964, it was after 1963. And so it was after the laws in Birmingham, the Jim Crow laws, had been technically abolished, but that did not change attitudes. And so these women very bravely got up and decided they were going to try to do something about that. And following that principle of it's all about relationships, they formed a panel, and they kind of trained for this. They modeled this on a national program. They trained about how to respond to difficult questions, and they were very difficult questions. And they went into, they just went wherever they could. They went to libraries, they went to club meetings, anywhere they could get a speaking engagement, they would get up and talk about personally. And there was like a Black woman, a Jewish woman, a Protestant woman, an Oriental woman. They talked about how it felt to be discriminated against. And they were very personal about what they shared. And I think, you know, not many people know about this little group and organization of women, but I think people started listening to them. People that never thought they would listen, listened. And that was a huge thing, but it's something forgotten by history.
They were facilitators. By and large, they were facilitators. They were also good cooks. And back in those days, you know, we were using rotary telephones. Back in those days, sitting down for a dinner, you would have more than just your family at dinner, and a lot of things have been discussed over very good meals, and once in a while a drink or two. I remember, as Teresa was alluding to, even when it was against the law to sit together, Emil Hess and Dick Pizitz would be here at the house, standing at the bar and discussing how to get rid of these white and colored signs in their department stores, what it was going to take for the city. They were losing business because of the law, and they didn't think that that was fair. And so Fred Shuttlesworth took the opportunity to say, well, let's deal with this. You get rid of these signs and hire some black folks to come and work for you. Maybe we can get the city to back off to this segregation ordinance. And it worked. It worked. There was a lot of congeniality between blacks and whites that were working together, facilitated by the women. A good meal, a good drink, and let's have a little talk. And good things came of this. And nowadays, the world is so fast and so impersonal that I dare say that this procedure is still possible. But I tell you one thing, it definitely worked. And a lot of that had to do with the hospitality of the women involved.
Amen. Amen. Miss Deanie was no mean cook, and neither was Mrs. Barefield-Pendleton. And I just love the segue into the fact that this really hits home, because we've got to have a blending of the races, and it hits home so much because there are so many factions trying to divide us racially, you know, gender-wise and racially, that we've got to see past all that and keep our eye, for the colloquialism, but keep our eye on the prize, which is to all get out and vote, you know, come November. So I wanted to play a clip that emphasizes why inclusivity is so important, especially we're dealing with this.
Between whites and blacks in order to grow.
The movement needed a student leader with the sensitivity to empathize and interact with whites while motivating and keeping the respect of blacks. But who could be the general of a war powered by intellect and economics?
Nobody particularly wanted to mess with Reverend Frank Dukes.
There are many among us who would like to express our views, but as you stated, that some persons fear economic reprisals, and that same thing holds true for some members of the white race. They would like to stand up and be counted, but the same retaliations would be directed upon them also. So if a man asks me a question, I can speak for myself, because I would not be economically depressed, because I'm already economically depressed.
And that's the key for us to understand that we're all in the same boat. And that was a clip from a documentary that CBS actually came to Birmingham and filmed it. It was called Who Speaks for Birmingham? But that type of understanding that whites were just as much prisoner by the Jim Crow system as, you know, blacks from an economic standpoint is what made the selective buying campaign of 1962, led by my dad and Dr. Jonathan McPherson and UW Clemens and Deanie Drew and Ruth Barefield-Pendleton, so successful. So what I think I better do, so that we do not run too far over time, is open up for questions. But I really am excited about the dialogue that seems to be opening up, and the understanding or the cognizance that we must bring people together so that we can defeat what has become an increasingly crucial election. So in closing, before we go into that, let me just let you see these women who still keep me in awe. Whoops.
Barefield-Pendleton will take the minutes.
So the
Sorry.
warriors stepped back and became historians.
Dr. Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference came into the city. I went down to see what I could do, along with Deanie Drew. The two of us went together. Someone said, someone needs to be writing this down, taking the minutes. And I don't know who it was, but I think it was either John Drew, Deanie's husband, or Deanie. So he said, Ruth Barefield-Pendleton will take the minutes, and I didn't know how to say no. So I started taking the minutes. I would go.
And those minutes became the only recorded, written recorded chronologically correct order of what took place in the strategy sessions with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his lieutenants, and the rest is history. So I think if we could talk to Jeff and TK, maybe we start off with a question. Can somebody, Audrey, are we going to type our questions into you, or so that we can ask a question, or do we just start asking questions audio wise?
I think we have a small enough group that if somebody
Okay.
wants to ask a question, they can just ask it.
Okay, so who would like to ask a question to either TK or Jeff? Just yell out. Don't everybody speak at once.
I have a question, Donna.
Okay, sure.
And this is kind of even left over from our earlier call. We were fortunate to have Jeff and Latasha Brown on the call, but you know, have the percentages of voting participation gone up or gone down? I know we saw an increase for the Doug Jones election, but overall, you know, have percentages gone up, or has it just become too difficult, especially for Black voters?
I don't think the percentages have gone up. They're about level as they were at 2016. However, the recent acts of violence, Ginger, are motivators. They are motivators. Unfortunately, they'll probably be motivators on both the left and the right. But I expect with the level of violence that has happened this year that the numbers will go up. I pray that they will go up on the side of reason and peace and justice, but overall I think they'll go up because the country is more polarized now I have ever seen it in my lifetime.
Even more so than you saw in the 60s, Jeff.
Yes, yes,
Okay.
yes. And the proclivity for violence is stronger now than ever. Kids are not wearing coats and ties. Women are speaking in vulgar ways now that I'm not comfortable with. I'm seeing the lack of education actually hurting. Is hurting the community.
What is our state motto? We dare defend our right to be ignorant. Yeah.
What do you think,
And
Teresa?
people, yeah, and people are exercising that right. Valerie, were you saying something?
Well, I was just going to say at Sidewalk, I just saw After Selma.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm hoping it's on Netflix and Prime soon because everybody should watch it. The data is completely data-driven film on what has happened since we had that Shelby lawsuit that gave the states that were under the obligations of getting their voting changes approved. What has happened ever since Shelby that was a success. And the fact that in 5 minutes after that was diluted, Texas, Alabama, all these states came up with voter ID. And not only voter ID laws, but, you know, and we saw this, closed DMV locations in predominantly African-American communities across, you know, North Carolina, Texas, Alabama, saying, oh, we don't have the money, but surgically making it difficult for people to get driver's license. It seems like a reasonable thing, but it's devastating for people who are struggling. And then there's computer systems now where you can strategically carve out the gerrymandering to surgical levels of all minorities are all in one voting district. So you continue to dilute minority votes. And it was gut wrenching because it was data, it was fact, it wasn't hyperbole. If you see that film, you realize the challenges and what happened in the last election and what our stress is. Legitimate, data-driven challenges are for November. And it's just very real that people are being disenfranchised all across the United States of America. It was heartbreaking to have the date I went home. I was supposed to stay for a 10 o'clock movie. I was like, I can't take it. I'm going home and go to bed.
Valerie, you make a very good point. And to all of us, you need to realize that the dilution of voting power happens in many, many, many different ways. When we first became astute at voting and researching gerrymandering and redistricting, we learned that you have to monitor the legislature to see what changes are being made subtly.
Yeah.
Not in the newspaper, but what changes are being recommended and approved or disapproved subtly in the legislature, so you would know where to expose it and where to make the attack. You must realize white folks didn't want black folks to have any more education. You should ask Lucius Pitts about this if he was still here. An educated black man was a real threat, a real threat. And so if he was educated and a voter, that's a double threat. Dixie did not want that, lady. Dixie did not want that at all. Mom used to tell me, you folks got too much education already.
And it's really spreading around the country. And that's why this discussion was so important today. And I did just look it up. After Selma is on Amazon Prime, Prime Video. If you are a Prime addict like me, then please make sure that you share this and let people see it. It will change your life. I was already on fire to try to make sure as many of our kids and students as possible were registered to vote, but it just galvanized me even more. And especially since there is a growing sentimentality to really send women back, you know, even before the suffrage movement, to take away the rights for abortion and the rights, you know, really to just have control of our own lives. So these are pivotal. This is a pivotal election because God knows how long Ruth Ginsburg's going to be able to hold on. I am just, you know, like really, really.
We have to remain diligent. We have to remain diligent and keep our knee on the American government so that it does not continue to dilute the voting power.
And that just, it just really brings it home. And I'm trying to rush. So Arju, at some point, let me do another program, and Nancy too, because they have been everything that is patient and good. But from a woman's standpoint, we've got to, and no matter what side you're on politically, whether you're Republican, Democrat, Independent, whatever, the right to vote is important. People have died for this. So Nancy's raising her hand and I'm shutting up. You're on mute. There you go.
I'm giving you a clap. That is a clap. Oh. It's ditto. Yeah. I mean, all this is so important. I mean, I'm writing down keywords like, I mean, we've just got to be hyper-focused.
Vigilant.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have a question.
Hey, yes.
Hey, it's Kendall. I know I've told you this to your space before, but your dad is one of my heroes. And one of the things that really, when I got to meet him and work with his interviews, what always stuck out to me and what was unique for the time is how much he emphasized the role of women in the local movement and how he could not have done that without him. And that's coming from someone who's a young adult and in college, and I was just always impressed with him always having that mature outlook. So my question on that point, you know, Jeff, what do you think your mom, and TK, what do you think your mom would think about what's going on right now? I mean, I haven't been a voter for long, but I've never seen in my lifetime a time where I've felt this amount of oppression as a white woman. And so that doesn't happen often, but I wonder what they would think comparing then to now. Have they seen this type of voter oppression and the type of dialogue and rhetoric that's going on about women in this country? I wonder if they'd ever felt this before.
Yes, that's a good question. They felt it before in the resistance, not only for women, but for men as well. So the problem is reoccurring. What we feel today in comparison to the way we felt in 1965 is that we've seen an abuse of freedom, okay? Once we got the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act passed, I can tell you for a fact that Martin and all of his crew never dreamed that we would abuse the freedom in the way that we have. When kids are undisciplined and the law is preventing parents from disciplining their children, then we have this abuse. We have the things that are what we call horrors in society today, things that we don't like to see on the street. This is as a direct result of abusing the freedom. Just because it's not against the law does not mean it is the right thing to do. Okay, and our sense of morality has diminished over the last 50 years, where it was on the rise upcoming into the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And so that's a tragedy. That's a tragedy. Rather than us being better off, we're worse off because we have abused the freedoms given to us by these laws. Now, we have to be careful. I don't want to use that against us, but the point is, if you notice Frank Dukes, he was always a man of integrity. He was a man of distinctive quality. Same for Martin, same for Lucius Pitts. The women involved were classy women. These were women that were not vulgar. They were not guttural, all right? And they were role models. These men and women were role models for little kids like me, and I wanted to emulate them in my adult life. The question is, who is emulating me now? Who is emulating Ruth Barefield-Pendleton now? Who's even emulating Donna Dukes or yourself? You see my point? My point is that we are not, there's a disconnect. We are not connecting with young people as we should, so that they would really realize the very intrinsic power of the vote and the power of human compatibility.
And understanding that every vote counts. So to TK, to wrap up with what I'm just really, really enjoying, to be honest with you, but I know other folks have stuff they got to do. TK, to go back to Kendall's question about how your mom would feel about this, in as much as she did lobby, literally, you know, in the legislature for women's rights to vote, how do you think she would weigh in on what in some cases I've noticed is some apathy among women voters regarding whether or not they're even going to participate in the election?
Very upset by that, and you know, it seemed to me, as looking at what she did, that she was always trying to climb a mountain that was really steep in front of us. And yeah, that apathy is the worst thing. And also we have to be so careful not to divide ourselves. And that is the tool that has been used against us. And I say us, meaning all of everyone who is not part of the status quo, in myriad of different ways. You know, I remember asking my mother about George Wallace, and she told me that he really wasn't personally as prejudiced as he came across. And I said, well, then why does he come across it? Why is he projecting that? Why is he doing this? And she said, because he's very smart. And he realized that if you divide the poor people into poor whites and poor blacks and make them fight each other, that you don't have, you know, then you keep their power down. And the same thing happened to women in the early attempts to get the vote for women. The amendment, I think it was the 11th Amendment, that gave Black men to vote. The 14th Amendment was the first time the word man, as in man, not woman, got introduced into the Constitution of the United States. And the 11th Amendment, that was to protect slaves and make sure they, you know, were citizens, left out women. And that split the people that were to get together before. You know, the women's movement started with abolitionists that wanted to stop slavery, and they were all together in the same boat. And when that happened, it split them up, and that's why it took women until 1920 to actually get the vote. So we got to be really careful that we're not being split. I see it in the religious community, where certain issues are put up in order to keep people who otherwise would be perhaps sympathetic to people that are fighting for equality, and so forth and so on. So
I love that.
That's a great segue. And as much as I hate to interrupt this wonderful conversation, we have run just a little over time, but I was not going to jump in because I did not want this discussion to end. But to be respectful of all y'all's time, I need to let you know that on September 10th, Christina Almanza from Buffalo Rock will be joining us to speak about biases and the challenge of diversity, equity, and inclusion. If you want to continue this discussion, I encourage you to go over to our Facebook group and carry on there. I think it would be great for us to, you know, find concrete ways that we can continue this discussion and continue to make a change. One thing that stood out to me that TK said while she was talking about the Friends in Action is she said it's all about relationships. And I think one of the strengths of the Women's Network of Birmingham is our relationships that we have forged and the people that we've met and the friends we've made. And if we all just keep joining together, there's nothing that we can't do together, because, and I'm going to ask everybody to unmute. Y'all unmute. Everybody unmute yourselves. I'm watching all those little red microphones go away. Because as a group, we are women helping women. Let's try it one more time together. We are women helping women.
Women.
Thank